Hello, my name is Trinity MacArthur. I am a second year student at Penn State Dickinson Law and am participating in the Manglona Lab for Gender and Economic Equity. For one of the lab's projects, Witnesses to Herstory, we are capturing the personal experiences of women in education, sports, and the workforce during a dynamic era in the United States. Today, I have the privilege of interviewing Carol Cleland. She is a philosopher, a scientist, and a professor. Thank you for joining me today, Dr. Cleland.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start at the beginning. When and where were you born?
I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1948, December 21st.
And what was it like growing up?
Well, I was born in a farm. I was born in Pittsburgh, but I lived in a farm, and I had on both sides of my family. My grandparents were farmers, and it was a big farm, probably about 380 acres on Scotts Ridge Road in Zelienople, Pennsylvania. And across the street was my aunt and uncle, and down a couple of other streets was another aunt and uncle, all of whom were farmers. So I grew up in a farming community with relatives close by until I was 9 years old. And my father, who inherited the farm, sold it during a period of time in which they were overproducing and they were encouraging people to put their farms in the land bank. And my dad never really wanted to be a farmer. And as soon as his parents both died, he sold the farm and we moved to Arizona. I was 9 years old. And then after I lived in Arizona until I was a in high school, basically a freshman in high school, and I moved to northern Arizona from Phoenix. I lived in Phoenix until then, to northern Arizona, and then when I was a junior in high school, moved to California, Chico, California.
So, if your parents weren't farmers, what did they do?
Well, they were farmers initially. My mother was the daughter of a farmer. My father was the son of farmers, and he was a farmer. My mother was also a K through fourth grade teacher. So she didn't teach when I was young, but she had taught before I was born. And then she quit and had three kids. Me, I was the oldest, and my two brothers. And my father really wanted to be an engineer, and he had tried to go, and was from a family that was very accomplished. They famous economists, aeronautical engineers. They'd all gone after the war. They had fought in the war, and they had gone to college on the GI Bill. So none of them were farmers. He was caught in the middle. He and my Uncle Paul, there were 9 children. And my Uncle Paul and he were supposed to stay home and help Grandpa with the farm. And so they were forced to do that. My dad wanted to go to the war. He was not able to do that. He was considered to be important for agriculture. And then after the war, he didn't have the money to go back to school like my uncles did, all of whom became really very accomplished educators, engineers, etc., lawyers. And so my dad, when he married my mother, took some courses, but he was already in his 30s and he was feeling like he just didn't have he felt intimidated. So he became a mechanical designer, but he was extremely talented at designing mechanical things. He could fix anything. And so he worked part-time while he was on the farm when I was little as a mechanical designer. And once he sold the farm, then he moved to Phoenix and became a mechanical designer. And my mother resumed teaching in Arizona, teaching second through fourth grade, and eventually she did special education.
So, you said you had two brothers growing up. How did you divide the housework with your brothers?
Well, and when growing up, my mother was a really remarkable woman. She had gone to college, of course, and she had been pursuing a master's degree in English. And she was told, "Why are you doing this? You can't possibly get a PhD. There's no point." And then this really ritzy school district came and was looking at the college she was at for somebody to teach. And they recommended her, and everybody said, "Well, just take this. It's a really prestigious job. It's an excellent school, and there's no point in you pursuing higher education because nobody will hire a woman." So she took that job, and then she met my dad, and they got married. She met my dad through my dad's brother, who was then a school teacher and later became a corporation lawyer. This was before the war when they met. And then they took a long time to have kids because my mother's first baby died. It was breech birth, and she was really damaged, and she never thought she'd be able to have kids. And then she got pregnant with me, and then bang, my brother, 12 months, 13 months, 4 months later, he was 13 months younger, and then my other brother, and she was just totally shocked. But it took her 6 years after her first baby died in breech birth to have the other baby. And then she had to quit as soon as she was teaching when she had me. Next in a little one-room schoolhouse near the farm, but they demanded that she quit as soon as her pregnancy showed with me, and so she didn't go back until we went to Arizona. And my brothers, and I was just going to say how it was really quite remarkable because my mother never made me feel that the role of a woman was to do housework, and the role of the boys was to be, outside and doing. She never made me feel intellectually inferior to my brothers. We used to do arm wrestling, and I would win, and she would laugh and say, in a few years, you probably won't, but go ahead. So I never grew up. It wasn't until I got into college that I had any impression that I couldn't do whatever I wanted or that I was somehow inferior to men.
So were you aware at the time when she was turned down for higher education and had to quit her job when she was pregnant? Were you aware of what was happening there as a child?
Well, remember, she had to quit pursuing higher education long before I was born. When I was born, she was 38. So this happened when she was in her early to mid 20s. She told me about it later, but it was not something I was aware of, nor was I aware that when she was 37 or whenever she got pregnant with me, that she had to quit because she was pregnant. It wasn't a big deal because they were on a farm, and she and my dad, the teaching was not critical to financial survival, so she just quit because she was told she had to quit. So I don't think it bothered her especially because she was, after 6 years of losing her first baby, she was pretty excited about having me.
So you moved to Arizona when you were 9 years old. Did you notice a difference in your primary education between when you lived in Pittsburgh and when you lived in Arizona?
Yes, because when I lived I was outside of Pittsburgh in Zillionople. My first 2 years of school were in a little one-room schoolhouse with outhouses and a wood stove and a big bell that rang when the students had to come into the classroom, and 3 grades in one classroom. My last year, when I was in third grade, they had built a new school in Zillionople, a very modern school, and I went to that school. I was bused to both schools. So, when I went to Arizona, the biggest difference was PE. They were very serious about sports. So, I had never had been, they had track and field, they had volleyball, soccer. So all of this was new to me. And it was partly because it was so warm in Arizona. And I don't remember there being any physical education when I was a kid in Zillionople, but I could be wrong. Certainly when I was in the one-room schoolhouse, there wasn't. I mean, it was quite amusing because, we'd have recesses and the girls were always afraid to go to the girls' bathroom because the boys would put snakes in it. So it was kind of the standard thing. My mother said, "Oh yeah, it happened to me when I was a kid too." So there was that kind of thing that went on. There was a big slide, I know. And there was a really mean boy who tried to push me off when I climbed up the slide. So I was afraid to climb up to the top of the slide. And I do remember this. I said to my mother, there's this boy who scares me because he tries to push me off the slide. And she says, "Oh, he just likes you." And I was shocked about that being a sign of liking. I remember deeply shocked that somebody who would pick on me like that was a sign of them liking me. I never forgotten that. That was really weird.
So when you had the opportunity to do sports in Arizona, were there opportunities for female students as well as male students?
Oh yeah, well they were. They had the certainly when I was in fourth grade, I came into it was a fourth grade where I entered into school at I think it was fourth grade. Yeah, it was fourth grade when I entered into school at in Arizona, and I think the boys and girls, I can't remember whether they separated them, but I know we had PE shorts, and I remember, I was shocked because we did this long distance running where you ran around and around the track, and I can't remember. I think they may have separated us, but I do remember I was running around the track, not trying particularly hard. And when it was done, the PE teacher came up to me and said, "You know how good you did?" And I was shocked that anybody would care about how good I. So I turned out I came in first. I was always really good at long distance running, but I never pursued it because I had decided I wanted to be an intellectual, and I thought to be an intellectual, you had to be bad at sports. So I made a point not to do well in sports.
You mentioned wearing gym shorts. Did you have a dress code at your elementary school?
Only for PE. I'm pretty sure that they did separate us by sexes now that I think about it, even in fourth grade. I remember my blue gym shorts. So, no, they were just gym shorts with a little blue button down top for PE. We only had a uniform for PE, and that went all the way through um, grade school. In high school, you did not have to do PE.
What kind of clothes would you wear since you didn't have a dress code?
Well, you had to wear a skirt. You were not allowed to wear pants. And that went all the way through high school when I moved to Chico. They would have a day, and this happened in elementary school, and it also happened in high school, where girls could wear pants, but they claimed that it would excite the boys and they wouldn't be able to concentrate. It was really weird. So you couldn't wear pants. And also, in my last few years of high school, it was quite interesting because you couldn't wear a skirt that came above your knees, and mini skirts were becoming popular. And so on the last day of high school, I was one of the best students in the class. I was, the egghead in the class. And I wore a skirt below my knees, and everybody was waiting for them to what they do is they make you kneel down on your knees to see if the skirt touched the ground. If it didn't, they'd send you home. Mine was significantly above my knees. They never sent me home. Everybody thought that was really interesting. That was my last day of class to see whether they would put up with it. So they did.
Did you oftentimes test the boundaries of those requirements?
No, not really, because it was kind of pointless. I did it the last day. I thought they were kind of ridiculous, but I was really too busy. I was really interested at the time being a scientist, and I was kind of a star in my science classes. So I really didn't pay a lot of attention to what I wore. I wore skirts because that's what you had to wear, and dresses, but they didn't, and I wore pants on pant days, but you had to wear a dress basically. I remember when I was a kid back in Pennsylvania, during cold wintry days, my mother would put corduroy pants under my skirt to keep me warm. And I wasn't the only girl that had to wear a skirt over a pair of corduroy pants. It was sort of absurd.
Do you remember where your love of science came from, since you said you were already interested in it during school?
Yeah, I do. It came from two things. One is um, I had been kind of sickly, and I think it was partly because mother didn't want me going to the one room schoolhouse. The woman who taught it, are you ready for this? Her name was Mrs. Rape. That's her name. And she was an evangelical Christian. And she would make us sing, this little light of mine, and make us recite the Lord's Prayer. And mother was very annoyed by that. And she kept trying to get her to read us Caldecott award winning books like Bridie of the Grand Canyon. And she had a real hard time because this woman just wanted to read from the Bible to us. So mother kept me home on the excuse I was sick. And I did have pneumonia twice, so I did have some sickliness. But I've often wondered if she just didn't want me in that school. And so, any rate, by the time I went to the East Coast, basically, I was, I had missed a lot of school. So as I entered school, I was considered not to be particularly exceptional because I missed so much school. And mother was really worried that because she had this kind of bias. It turns out she was really gifted in mathematics, and so were a number of her relatives, but she thought she was bad at it. So she was going to Phoenix, and when we were in Phoenix, we had just moved there. She was going to get her credential to teach in Arizona, and she took me along and put me in this summer class, which was supposed to be remedial math. And there was this teacher. He was a guy, gray haired, and it was the most, I can't remember his name, and I feel very badly about that. It was probably for a period of 4 or 5 weeks or 3 or 4. I don't know. It seemed like a long time for me, but I was not, I think I was 10 years old at that stage. And so they put me in this class for remedial work, and it was really easy for me. And so I ended up helping the other kids. And apparently they probably had mirrors. We discovered that when I went into the other class, where you could look into the class. And he came in and he says, Carol, you seem to be doing really pretty good. I want you to teach the class. So I was really surprised and flattered. And so I taught the class. And then he came in again and he said, I want to talk to your mom when she comes to pick you up. So mother came to pick me up, and she was all excited after she talked to him and said, they're going to put you in the gifted class. And so they put me in this special class for gifted kids, where I really flourished and I loved it. And I particularly loved science, and he encouraged me in my science. We had various projects and things. I was one of the 2 best people in that class of gifted kids. And after I came back from that class, I was the star in my rest of my grade school. I was up the top. It just made me confident that I could do whatever I could do. So I ended up excelling, and I became really interested in science. And I kind of had my dad's gift for fixing things. I was really upset because we did have boys had to go to shop, and the girls had to go to home ec, which I hated. And the boys made solar furnaces with broken glass. And I just thought it was so cool. They could, get the sun's rays to interact in such a way that it would heat stuff like boil water. So I really wanted to do that, but my dad would not let me break a bunch of glass mirrors to do it. So he got me some metal, and I tried to put together one that wasn't very good. But then he decided I was trying to use his heavy tools, and he locked me out of his shop. And then I picked the lock and got in anyhow. And he was just really frustrated with me at that stage because he couldn't keep me out of things. And I was always trying to, I took a radio apart, and then I wanted to plug it in, and he was just afraid I was going to kill myself. But he wasn't willing to sit with me like my brothers and actually tell me how things worked. And he was really talented, but he just seemed to feel that I was doing, if my brothers had been doing that, and they weren't, I was much more like my dad that way. He would have, I'm sure, sat down with them and worked with them. But with me, he just tried to lock me out of things. So to be a long story short, I then started reading things. I remember one of the most pivotal things in my, when I was in about 8th grade, I read 1, 2, 3 Infinity, which I think was written by Isaac Asimov. And then I got obsessed by infinity, and I just, science was my big thing.
If your father felt that he needed to lock you out of the tools, how did your mother feel about your excellency with science?
My mother really thought I should be a high school English teacher. That was the ambition she had for me, because she had been K through 4th grade. So she thought I should be one step above. So none of my parents were scientifically oriented. My dad was a sperm engineer. He taught as a mechanical designer, young engineers out of college, because he could do things, he could fix anything. So he functioned as an engineer in his job, but he never got the title. I know when he finally died, when I was in college, that number of young BAs and engineer came by and they were crying as they told me how pivotal he'd been in teaching them how to be engineers, which is deeply ironic. But my mother never told me I couldn't do that. She just thought it was weird. I was never told by my mother that I couldn't do something. She always said, let me discover my own limitations. It was, and she did not like housework. So she never encouraged me to like housework.
Um, what kind of classes did you take in high school? I know you mentioned home ec for the girls and
It was all science. I took all the advanced classes. I took two biology one and biology two, chemistry, physics. I will say this about all my high school teachers thought I was really great. And they never suggested I was less talented than boys. Remember, this would have been in the late 60s. It would have been 66, 65, 66. I graduated in 67. And they all thought I should go to Caltech. So they encouraged me to apply to Caltech. And this is a lovely story. I applied to Caltech only to get back a letter from a woman dean saying that Caltech did not yet admit women, but they were thinking of doing so in a couple of years, and that I should reapply when I entered grad school.
so speaking of college, you went to the University of California in Santa Barbara for your
Yes.
degree. Did you enjoy college?
I went there because it just opened a new College of Creative Studies, and it was very selective, and they wanted kids who were especially talented to be fast tracked. And I entered in physics. And so I was one of only four girls. One of only, there were five students, two upper division and three lower division freshmen. And I was the only woman or girl. I guess I was pretty much a girl still at that stage. And there was the guy who was teaching. It was who was head of the physics group, was a experimentalist. His name was Herbert Broida. He's passed away a long time ago. And he really wanted people for his lab. I wanted to do basically theoretical physics. So it was a bad match to begin with. But what really was hard is he went around shaking everybody's hand. And he came to me, he shook my hand. He said, we weren't going to admit women initially, but you were just so intriguing. We decided to admit you. So I had basically, for the rest of my time there, and I eventually did not get the degree in physics. I was just felt like I was on trial, and it was really oppressive because I felt like, that they were just waiting for me to fail. I had never felt that way before. It was my first introduction, really, to real sexism about women. So I had, I basically tried to avoid Herbert Broida, and I slowly, it just wasn't working out because I was so intimidated by what he had said. It just really shocked me. I had never actually, in high school, my teachers all thought I was fabulous. He never gave me a chance. It was the first day we met, and he says, we weren't going to admit women, but you were just so, not great, brilliant, intriguing. So it was very intimidating. And so basically, I ended up trying other fields, including, and I ended up getting a degree in math. And trying all the different fields, I was really science oriented. I took basically 2 years of chemistry, including organic. I really liked geology, so I tried geology, but then I was the only woman. And then when I went into the field trips, I would be in my tent and I'd come out and everybody's around the fire joking. And as soon as I appear, silence. Because I was the only woman and they were obviously talking about women. It was just very awkward. So I couldn't stand the field trips. As a result, even though I love, mucking around in the wild and collecting stuff. So that didn't work out. But I ended up basically taking all the senior level physics courses that didn't have labs. And I ended up taking 2 or 3 years of geology. I had most of the basic geology courses, 2 years of chemistry, and a year of biology. And I just couldn't figure out what to major in. I was taking a lot of math because I required the math for the, especially advanced physics courses. And I had gotten married at this stage. And I jumped into the marriage, I think partly, and it didn't last. I did have a daughter out of it, but I think I got into the marriage partly because I had to prove I was a real woman. It was very hard I also got pregnant because I was kind of a rebel and I wasn't very careful. And so I got married prematurely and it worked out for a while, but eventually it didn't. But anyhow, we were sitting around. He was a grad student and we were sitting around and he said, well, you really ought to figure out, because I've been taking course overloads for 5 years. Well, you really ought to think about graduating. We sat down and figured out I could graduate with a degree in math with one more course. So I became the accidental math major. And I discovered philosophy my junior year, just before I graduated, which I loved. But I had a degree in math, and one of my math teachers had been a computer science was just beginning, and it was in the math departments. So, and my former husband was finishing his PhD in biology. So I ended up working for over a year for a little startup company called Color Harrison as a software engineer.
So what made you feel the need to get married in an effort to prove that you were, as you put it, a real woman?
I don't know. It was just kind of a feeling. I had a feeling I was worried about being unmarriageable because I was so kind of eccentric and weird. And I will admit that my then former husband liked that. We used to argue about cosmological biases. So he was very supportive. He asked me actually after 2 or 3 dates whether or not I'd ever noticed sexism. And I was very impressed by that. And so we had a discussion of sexism. So he seemed very, shall we say, well-educated, open-minded for somebody at that time. And so, it was just, but I do think my thought, oh yeah, well, this didn't help. So when I went off to college when I got into this special college of creative studies, I also got a Regents scholarship to go to UC Santa Barbara, which made me feel a lot better after get the letter from Caltech. They wouldn't admit women. So I was, until Herbert Broida told me that I was too intriguing, I was really excited. And so when I went off to college, I was going off to college to be a physics major. My dad called me aside and he said, no man will marry a physics major.
How did that make you feel?
I'm really worried that, somehow I wouldn't be a real woman, that somehow I was worried. I didn't really consciously worry about it. But it really did worry me. And then I was pretty rambunctious as a teenager, always arguing and fighting. And mother at one point told me that something to the effect, I don't remember how she said it, but in high school that I should be careful because I might destroy someone I love because I was so cantankerous and difficult. It's funny because people were doing drugs and I never did drugs. I was just really feisty. And so I think I had a kind of a worry about, I do know that I originally was really interested in living in Sen. I thought that would be a really good thing to do. So when I met Bob, I thought that's what we do. We wouldn't rush into marriage. But then then the riots occurred. This was the Vietnam War. And this was 1969, and they were all the Vietnam riots. And the governor of the state had said, if the students want a bloodbath, it was Ronald Reagan, by the way, let it be now. And I was arguing vehemently for this, but I was not really involved in the riots, but I was involved in some of the protests in Isla Vista. And the kind of signature thing is like Bob and I were, dating, and he had an apartment across from where a lot of the riots ended up occurring. They weren't really so much riots as police beating people up. And I had decided to spend the night with Bob. And basically, I told my friends that I was going to be spending it with Bob, but if they got a phone call from my mother, that they should tell her that I was doing something else, so she wouldn't be worried, because I know parents would not want me living in sin. So basically, the riots were occurring. I was with Bob as we all stood around singing songs against the Vietnam War. The police showed up in riot gear and they began encircling us. And when they started encircling us, some people knelt down and stayed in the center. They got really badly beaten. We backed up. And then at some stage, the police started throwing tear gas and running. So we ran to his house. And we had already gotten prepared with vinegar and the stuff to protect you against tear gas. So we rushed into the house, shut the door, and the phone rang. And I picked it up and said, "Can't talk now, we're being gassed." Click. It was my mother. And so she was totally freaked out. She was sure she'd seen a redhead, you'll appreciate this, in some of the color TV of the rioters. She'd seen a curly-haired redhead, and she was sure it was me. It wasn't, because I wasn't at that particular thing. And my parents had decided that I needed to come home. They didn't want me to stay at UC Santa Barbara. So to add on to that, I'd gotten pregnant at this stage. So I was pregnant. I was throwing up all the time because, it was rather stressful. I remember basically going to class. Students don't do this anymore. But I would go to class. Then before class, I'd throw up. Then I'd go to class and I'd come back and I'd throw up. It was really awful. And so we were talking, and neither of us wanted a kid. But, and I was told by my parents I had to come home because I was out of control. I had to go to Chico State, and I didn't want to go to Chico State. I had at this stage quit being involved with the, basically the College of Creative Studies. I don't know whether I still had a regional scholarship, but I had quit being involved with College of Creative Studies just because I couldn't stand the physics. And so I was looking for another major, and I was taking math, and I had discovered philosophy, I think, at that stage, and loved it. And so to make a long story short, Bob, my then boyfriend, proposed to me. And so I agreed to get married. So I think that's probably why I married so young, because I was pregnant, and my parents were threatening to take me home. And they were really amazed when I got married. They couldn't believe it. So when I took him home to meet them, my father stuck out his hand and said, "I don't know who to congratulate," which was really offensive, because it was like, "Oh, you found somebody. I never thought you would. He'll calm you down." So yeah, that's what it was like. So I got married. So I think it was pretty much that, because I really was eager to live in sin at that stage. I thought that was the radical thing to do. And so we got married, and I had an abortion because I really didn't want to have. Took a collection from friends, and abortion wasn't quite legal. And so I went to to a doctor who was very sympathetic, but he wasn't very sympathetic initially. So Bob went in with me, but the doctor took me. And when I said, he agreed I was pregnant, and I said I wanted an abortion, he gave me a huge sum of money it would cost me, and I didn't have that money. And I said, "Is there nothing you can do?" And he says, "No, that's my fee." And I said, "Well, my boyfriend's out." He goes, "Oh, your boyfriend?" I said, "He's a grad student." "Oh." So he invited Bob in, and he reduced his price to $150.
How did that feel?
It felt awful. I realized, it was only because I had a boyfriend that I was going to get the abortion. So then I had the abortion. I'll just tell the whole thing. I had the abortion, but I ran into trouble after the abortion because nobody told me that I shouldn't run around and bike and do all these things. So as soon as I had the abortion, I no longer had morning sickness. I felt so much better. And I was very early in my pregnancy. I must have been 5 weeks pregnant, and I stepped on a nail. And so I had to go to the student health center because of the stepping on a nail. And the doctor there treated it. And then they sent me home and I started bleeding from the abortion. And so I went back to the health center and they kept me overnight and then they kicked me out at 6 in the morning. He said the doctor didn't believe in abortion and I had to leave. And so I said, well, it's a long walk to married student housing. And they said, I'm sorry, we don't care. The doctor said to kick you out right now. So I walked bleeding all the way to my apartment. And then I called the doctor who'd given me the abortion. And that doctor said, you have to come back to the hospital. And I said, no, I can't because my parents will find out. And he says, well, your parents have to find out. And I said, I'm not coming. And he hung up on me. Because remember, it was only quasi-legal at the stage. They had done it. They had actually put me under DNC for period troubles. That's how I got it. And so I went back, and this was summer by now, and I had a bunch of hippie friends. We were living in an apartment, and I told them what was going on, and I said, we need to get some ice. I was going to put an ice pack on my stomach because I thought that would stop the bleeding. Really stupid. And I just lay there for 3 days in agony because I was pushing out clots the size of your fist. And I figured either I'd bleed to death or I'd recover. And I recovered. And my hippie friends came in and they talked to me. One of them was a poet. He read me poems. They fixed me food. And everybody waited to see whether I'd survive, which I did. And once I survived, I called the doctor, who then said, oh, well, you should come in now. It's time for your post-abortion DNC, they called it then, checkup. And so I went in and he basically took a blood sample and said, you're very anemic. And he emptied his drawer of samples of iron pills and told me to take them.
Were your friends the only support system that you had throughout all of this?
My father had told me he believed abortion was murder. So I couldn't tell my parents.
How did you feel when you had to make the decision to get one and all of the follow-up?
When I had to what now?
When you had to make the decision to get an abortion in the legal atmosphere as well as your familial atmosphere.
I was really relieved to get an abortion because I did not want to have a baby. I was like 20, maybe I was 21. I was very young, and I wanted to become a scientist or I wanted to become an academic. And my former husband and I had just talked about this, and we thought we'd be we were kind of long term, but neither of us were interested in marriage. And he was going to be a professor of marine biology. He did microbiology, and I wanted to be a professor. And I was thinking maybe even being a math professor. And so I got pregnant the first time I had sex. The first time.
What are those odds?
Yeah. Well, apparently they're not that at that age. You're very fertile. So the odds were. And we actually used protection, but it wasn't good. It was foam birth control. So that's what we used, which is just stuff you get over at the supermarket. And I was waiting to go on birth control pills because I had seen that doctor, and he had given me prescription for birth control pills, but I had to wait for my period. And we just didn't wait. And I got pregnant. It was quite astonishing.
You mentioned being involved in some of the Vietnam protests. Were you, as you experienced the sexism in the physics department, the abortion difficulties, did you ever participate or see protests for the second wave of feminism during that time?
Not really, because most people were Vietnam War oriented. So I was involved. My apartment was tear gassed. A bunch of LA police broke in. I wasn't there at the time. This is when I was with my boyfriend and future husband, and they broke in, and my roommate, who was also radical, had signs on her window like war is unhealthy for children and other living things. And they had ran upstairs. It's in the middle of the night, and told her to take down those signs. They didn't like them. And then they threw a tear gas grenade at her feet. And she rushed down. And the next day we came over. The tear gas grenade was still there. My former husband took it out and put it on basically the patio. And we called the police, and the police came and got it. And then they announced there'd been no tear gassing. Students had lied about it.
How did that feel?
Pictures. I still have pictures of that grenade. And then they claimed that students had staged the pictures. So, yeah, I was involved mostly in the Vietnam War protests. I don't remember any feminist marches or protests at that time. I think it must have been later. This was 1969.
How did it feel when they said that it was fabricated?
Well, it made me feel that I can never trust the police again. A lot of us knew other people who had the tear gas grenade, and they just made it up, and they split heads. They'd beaten students, tear gassed them. They had brought in the Los Angeles police, and they were kind of out of control. So I'm not sure how much the Santa Barbara police did, but the Santa Barbara police came and took the tear gas grenade, and they're the ones who said there were no tear gas grenades. The students had made it up, and they said they had staged it when we had pictures of the grenade. Pretty heavy duty.
So,
Yeah, no, it was I had quite a college experience, not like others.
not like mine.
Yeah.
So you graduated from college in 1973 with your mathematics degree, and then you mentioned that you worked as a software engineer. Remind me, did you say that you worked with your husband at that company?
No, not there. So I had this job at this little startup company. It was called Color Harrison, and Glenn Color had been my math professor, and he was trying to solve the speech problem, get a computer to understand human speech. And he thought he could do it with brute mathematics using fast Fourier transforms. So he was building a computer from scratch up, and he hired only his own students, and the compute hardware and software, and everything was in the math department in those days. And there were 10 or 11 of us. I was, at the time, there'd been another young woman who was a software engineer. She'd left. I came in, and I was a software engineer. And everything was coded in Octal. It was very primitive. There was no basically Fortran, no natural. It was all machine language. And so it was quite challenging because the computer was the first parallel processor. And there were certain things you could do and certain things you couldn't to get it to move faster. So they had been hardware designed to be able to process steps in parallel rather than sequentially, which made it much faster. I think it was 4 steps in parallel. And so it was real challenging to program it because you did it all in octal with numbers 0 through 8. And then you had to translate that into decimal. So it was quite challenging. And it was a lot of fun. And I'll tell you another story about that. I can't believe these stories. So the Navy was paying for the development of this machine. And we had one machine that nobody remembered how it was wired because it had been rewired so many times. And it's where you tested things. And then there was the main machine that was being developed for the Navy. But Glenn Color and the Navy, we never knew at the time why they wanted it. I discovered that later. I'll tell you about that. But once we had gotten the machine up and working, and we had basically gotten, you could code, we had basically developed the macro assembly language, which was the first step to developing Fortran or C or the higher level languages. C was not used much at that stage. It came later. So we developed, if I had stayed, I would have written the Fortran compiler, but I didn't stay. I did write basically code to put it on what was in the DARPA net, which was a military wide net that was the forerunner of the current net, which is quite exciting. So it was called the DARPANET, then it became the ARPANET, and then it became the web. But I wrote the programs to put it on the DARPANET, and you had basically a telephone, and you would seed it in this thing, and then it would talk and it was a very, very tiny web that was basically military based. It had been designed by the military. And so the day of the tests to get it accepted by the Navy, who is the one who was paying for it, and I had written all the mathematical tests, basically transforms or just identity relations. So the Navy came in, and we were called in the day before and they told me I had to wear a dress. Normally I didn't. They told us we had to take all the peace signs off of the walls. We were all hippies. So we ripped the peace signs off the walls. The admirals, they were just dripping in those, came in, and they had those old screens that faded out. So you had to punch them to get to see what was on the screen, or it faded out to basically save the screen. And it was running through the network control programs, the mathematical tests. And I was sitting with the other software engineers back in that room. We were all in our early 20s because he had hired his own students. And one of the admirals came by and said, and I was sitting next to the computer because they were my programs that were being run. And he said, how's it going? Where are we? And I reached up to push the button so the screen would light up. He grabbed my wrist and he says, "Girlie, I don't want you to break anything or damage something," he said. And then one of those other guys, and I was the only woman, laughed and said she wrote the programs and he wouldn't let go of my wrist. So he reached around and punched the screen so you could see.
How did that feel?
Really funny because we all laughed. At that stage, it was shocking. But we all thought, I didn't trust, law enforcement or military at that stage. Remember, this was after all the Vietnam War protests. So I was just kind of disgusted. And I did have these other young men, most of whom were older than me, because I'd come in, I was I think 22, and I can't remember how old I was, but they were like 24 and 25. And everybody thought it was really funny and rolled their eyes. They were all hippies,
So you said you did that job for about a year. What did you do after that?
I went basically to grad school. So my former husband finished his PhD. It might have been 2 years. I can't remember. Finished his PhD and got a job at the University of Massachusetts at what was it called? I can't remember. It's a small campus, I think, of the University of Massachusetts. And I entered Brown University as a grad student in philosophy. It's a little more complex than that, but I've told you enough stories. And anyhow, I got into that program, and then I got my PhD at Brown.
In philosophy?
Mm-hmm. Yep. But at one stage, I did work for the applied math department because I was really interested in logic. I was very good at math. And there was a guy in the applied math department which was designing basically, you'll find this really amusing, first distributed memories. So that's really hot now, where you actually have distributed parallel processing memories. Obviously, I had worked on a parallel processor. I was an extremely good programmer. Somebody in one of there was a math grad student in one of the classes in the philosophy department I was taking, and he recommended me because he was graduating to this guy named, I think it was Anderson. I can't remember his first name, but he was one of the first people working on these associative distributed memories. Recommended me because the guy who was doing this, Anderson, needed somebody to program for him. And so I got the job programming for him. And he thought I was one of the best programmers he'd ever seen. And so at some stage in my life, he said that in a letter. And at some stage in my life, when I got a job at Wheaton College as an assistant professor, and I got a message, there were only two of us, I got the job before I had gotten my dissertation. I was all but dissertation when I got it. And then I was informed that they weren't going to tenure that job. I hadn't known that. And so basically, I got a letter saying you can be denied tenure on grounds other than the quality of your scholarship or the quality of your teaching. So I ended up going to, and my former husband also got an offer from somebody who had been a student of Glenn Cutler, who had started his own company. And so I went basically with my former husband, and at that time I had a little daughter. And so we went to California. Anyhow, I could go on a heck of a long history.
So you graduated from college in 1973 and then went to begin working in graduate school a few years later. In 1972, Title IX passed, which expands gender equality in education. Did you notice a difference in your education between undergrad and graduate school?
I do know that Brown University didn't have many women grad students, but they treated me really well. And I doubt if it had anything to do with Title IX. I think there was a sense. My impression was that they had had a lot of smart women students, and it was good that they would go to grad school. I just don't remember there being a huge. As an undergraduate, my big problem was not that my teachers. I didn't really experience a lot of sexism, except for Herbert Gloria and saying they would did. But by the time I graduated, that was long past, and I was no longer in the College of Creative Studies. So I'm not sure what to say. I wasn't really conscious of sexism during these periods of time, except for just moments where things were just kind of shocking.
So what did you do after you got your PhD?
Well, like I said, I first I got a job at Wheaton College in Norton, Massachusetts, and then I got my PhD, and then I got a letter saying I could be denied tenure. And then my former husband, who didn't like teaching it was called Southeastern Massachusetts University, he got an offer to go to Santa Rosa and be part of, because he had worked, his PhD dissertation had been developing a computer system to look at, to analyze the behavior of these little single-celled organisms called seratium. And so he wanted to go. And so I agreed to go because I had been told I couldn't get tenure. And I was thinking of applying to Stanford University's Center for the Study in Language and Information. So, because that would fit with my stuff in computer science. So I went there. There I did experience quite a bit of sexism at Motion Analysis Corporation. So they made him, so the guy who ran it, the top engineer, had been with my former husband. They had worked together as graduate students with Glenn Cutler designing this motion analysis computer system, completely different than the company, the stuff I was working on with Glenn Cutler's company. At any rate, they initially were elected to hire me, but they got my portfolio for when I got my PhD, and then they suddenly hired me, and they told my former husband that the letters I had were amazing. And they are the ones who told me that Jim Anderson had written I was the best programmer he ever saw. So they immediately hired me, but they made my former husband my boss. And so and then some of the engineers would put up pictures, that were really offensive of, naked women and stuff like that. So I got into a war with them. So I found these pictures of men who were in loincloths, and I would put them up next to their naked pictures, and they would rip down my pictures. And then I would, say I would put them up somewhere else. So we had this huge war of the posters, which was kind of interesting. And when I finally left, I did get the postdoc at Stanford. And Stanford was nice enough in the Center for Studies in Language and Information to make me I got a fellowship in both computer science and philosophy, which gave me extra money. And when I left, as a joke, they had a fake arrest in which I was accused. They had a guy come in to arrest me. It was just all fake. Accused of failing to honor and obey my supervisor. And they went on like that, who was then my husband, right? And then on the day I left, they had my whole cubicle roped off as a toxic dump. It was all fun. It was in fun. They were sad to see me go. And then when I came back at one stage, one of the guys there who had been over me, and had really buggy software, rushed up and said, "I found a bug in your program." And I said, "Just one?" So it was, that was really very satisfying because his software is really, and he blushed crimson when he said that. So I got a real satisfaction for that. So I went to Stanford for a year, and then I went to Colorado.
What began your interest in philosophy? I know you said you found it interesting your junior year of college, but what made you
Because it was
motivate?
addressing questions that were related to why I wanted to be a physicist, like what is causation? What is space and time? How does causation interact with space and time? All of these questions in metaphysics were ones that were bothering me in physics, quantum mechanics, the collapse of the wave function. How do you make sense of that causally? So I was kind of predisposed to really ask the kind of questions that philosophers of science and people who do metaphysics ask, which are the really even more, that's why it's called metaphysics, more overarching than physics.
When you were studying and working in philosophy, did you notice more women that you could work with than you did in science fields?
Now, the men never went to that. My fellow male grad students, I was lucky to be married because I think I would not have survived graduate school if I had not been married. Because when I came home, I had my own sort of life. And I know that several times I tried to socialize with the grad students, being the only one, and I'd go out to, say, have lunch with them. And I remember once having lunch with them, and one of them said, "You'll never be a famous philosopher. You're too ordinary." Because I had a husband and a kid.
How did that feel?
I just thought he was an idiot. And I am the only person in my year that's really been successful. So touche to him. The others have not continued in philosophy, or they've gone to places that were less prestigious. But, I will admit, I've suffered here at CU Boulder. I had a colleague tried to destroy my getting tenure. He was really a nasty guy, and he didn't like me. And so, I've experienced a lot of sexism, not just personally for me, but for other women throughout my entire career in philosophy. As I told one woman colleague recently, my entire life intellectually has been a battle.
So what made you decide to go to Colorado?
Well, I got an offer. And, it's kind of like the priesthood. You go where you're set. And I wanted to continue being a professor. And it was a really top department at the time. So it was and it was also an area that was beautiful. And I thought I was very, very fortunate to be offered an assistant professorship in Boulder.
So I know you mentioned your first husband as your former husband. When did he become your former husband?
In After when my daughter graduated from high school, I left him, and he and I had been really fighting really badly, and he had been basically become an alcoholic, and he had threatened me, and I was decided I would wait till she finished high school and I'd leave him, and I did.
What year was that?
It would have been 1997.
Uh, so this is you started working at CU Boulder around 1986.
Correct.
Were you, was it were you able to continue working at CU, or did anything change?
Divorce made it much easier in some ways because I now could focus on my work, and he had become really difficult and hard. I think I was more successful than he was, and he had a hard time dealing with that. And so our relationship had been on the downhill since basically just before we arrived in Colorado. We had started really fighting when we were in Santa Rosa, emotional analysis. I think because I was so disgruntled about having him be my boss. But also, he was much lazier than I was, so he did not work as hard as I did. And so by the time I got to Colorado, I was really trying to figure out how to leave him, but it was hard to do because I had a little kid.
Uh, so I know while you were working at CU Boulder in the mid 90s, you also worked with NASA. What was that like?
I've been working with NASA since the late 90s through about 2010. Yeah, it was great. I mean, I worked with science teams and, and I was the only philosopher, and I made sure because I had such an extensive background in science, I really understood the science. And that was the key to my success because initially they were dismissive, and I've often had them, even just recently at a meeting in Telluride, them tell you, well, you know, most philosophers don't understand the science, but you really do. So that was the key to my success, is that I really understand the science, so I can do the philosophy, which they don't know. So I've often had them tell me, you know more science than I do, except in my narrow area of specialization. And then they also tell me, you told me something I didn't know. That's my secret. The
That's a
secret's
good
sauce.
secret.
Yeah.
Um, so over the course of your career, have you seen changes for women in STEM?
I've seen a lot in STEM, not much in philosophy. I think philosophy is really a problem. I think that so recently I have a lot of contacts at the University of Pittsburgh, and Michael Dietrich, who is chair of the department there, good friend. He told me they were looking for they were hiring 2 or 3 positions a couple of years back, and they only have one woman there, no men. And then all the finalists were men. And he said, "Look, you can't do this. We should have a woman." And they said, "With Trump there, we don't need to do that anymore." It's pretty disgusting. But what I have noticed is that there are a lot of women in geology now. I've talked to friends in geology, and the men have changed their minds about women being able to be out in the field. So geology, biology, even physics, philosophy still has very few women, and when they do have women, they really struggle to be successful, to get tenure. I'm very disappointed in philosophy. I think a much more, shall we say, it's less friendly to women than many of the sciences.
So I know, especially during my own lifetime, there've been a lot of push for women to be in STEM. You know, women in STEM has been a big thing lately. Do you think it would be beneficial to be applying these similar programs to areas such as philosophy that are still very male dominated?
It will never happen. I don't think it will happen. First of all, given the current administration, it's the opposite, right? Uh, and second of all, I think that the trouble is that analytic philosophy, which is the kind of philosophy I do, is supposed to be hyper rational, and there's still this sort of feeling that women are emotional and not as rational as men. And I think there's a tendency, because philosophy doesn't have raw data. Rather, it's more subjective. There's a tendency to, and they've done studies in this, you take a paper that was written by somebody and you put a woman's name on it and you put a man's name on it, and the journals will reject it if it has a woman's name but not a man's name. Similarly, it will get a harsher grade if it has a woman's name and not a man's name. So I think my discipline of philosophy has a lot of work to do, and there's a tolerance for behavior, I think, that shouldn't be accepted. But my women colleagues in the sciences say that happens there too. So I just don't know. I think it's going to get worse for women. I'm I'm glad I'm old. Despite all my struggles, it's been kind of an uphill battle. And now I'm looking at, sliding down the slope and the women who come after me having to climb it again. Very sad.
Uh, so we began our interview with me describing you as a philosopher, a scientist, and a professor. How would you describe yourself?
I would describe myself as a scholar and somebody who really wants to understand the nature of the universe. I would say that the most notable thing about me is I am extraordinarily curious and want to know.
And then looking back on all that you've experienced and achieved, what makes you most proud of your younger self?
Oh, that's hard to say. Um, Proud, I don't know, to have survived, to actually have succeeded in making it to a full professor. There was a stage when the guy was trying to get me denied tenure here that I thought, if I make it to associate professor, I'll be so happy and I'll never go further, because I had seen women come up, Ann Davis, one of them, for full professor, associate professor, and been denied here at CU Boulder. So I figured, there was probably a never make full professor. And I'm totally amazed to have made full professor and to have as many citations and have the reputation that I do, especially among scientists and also to some extent among philosophy. But as I said, there aren't very many high profile women in philosophy.
So, as we close our interview, thank you for sharing your story with me and our audience. It was an honor to hear your story, and I'm excited about the impact your story will have. Thank you for joining me today.